silence in that banquet hall could have swallowed me whole. My brother stood at the head of the table, wine glass raised, grinning at the 40 or so people who'd gathered to celebrate his promotion to senior partner. He'd rented out the private dining room at Hargrove's, the kind of place where the menu doesn't list prices and the waitstaff refills your water before you even notice the glass is half empty. "And of course," he said, tilting his glass toward me with that lazy smile I'd known my whole life, "my little sister could make it tonight. She works at the hospital." He paused, just long enough. "Filing." A few people laughed politely. Someone near the back didn't bother to make it polite. I smiled. I picked up my sparkling water and I smiled. And I thought about what my attending had told me 3 weeks earlier when I'd scrubbed in on a 14-hour posterior fossa resection. "You have the steadiest hands I've seen in 20 years of training residents." I thought about that, and I smiled. That was the night I decided I was done explaining myself to people who had no intention of listening. Let me back up. Growing up, my brother was the one everyone talked about. He was 7 years older than me, which meant by the time I was old enough to understand what dinner table conversation actually was, he was already the subject of it. His debate trophies, his LSA 8 score, his acceptance to Georgetown Law. My parents lit up when they talked about him. The particular brightness that parents get when a child has confirmed something they always privately believed about themselves. I was quieter. I read too much. I asked too many questions about things that made adults uncomfortable. Why the brain stops working when you hold your breath, what happens to consciousness during general anesthesia, whether the feeling of knowing something is stored in one place or scattered everywhere. My mother used to say I lived too much inside my own head. She didn't mean it as a compliment. My father was a construction foreman for 31 years, good at what he did, proud of the physicality of it, the tangible proof that a building stood because of decisions he'd made. He respected my brother's ambition because it looked like ambition. It wore a suit. It won arguments. It had a nameplate on a door. What I wanted to do? Cut into skulls, reroute blood vessels, remove the thing that was killing someone from the inside of their own brain. He understood academically. But emotionally, I think it unsettled him. He would look at me sometimes the way people look at a word they don't recognize. A slight narrowing of the eyes, a pause before moving on. I got into medical school on my first application cycle. I told my parents over the phone because I was living 3 hours away by then, doing my post-bac coursework at night while working as an emergency room scribe during the day. My mother cried a little. The good kind of crying, I think. My father said, "That's great, sweetheart," and then asked if my brother had called me about Thanksgiving plans. I told myself it didn't sting. I'd had a lot of practice telling myself things didn't sting. Medical school is a particular kind of beautiful suffering. You spend the first 2 years learning to think in a language that doesn't exist yet in your brain, rewiring yourself at a cellular level, failing at things in private so you can succeed at them in public. I loved it with the same intensity that I was occasionally terrified by it. I called my mother on Sunday evenings. I called my father less often because the conversations always felt like interviews for a job I hadn't quite convinced him to give me. My brother called when he needed something, to borrow my car when he visited the city for a conference, to ask if I knew anyone at the hospital who could get his girlfriend seen faster for a knee thing. I helped when I could. That's what you do. The first time he introduced me at a family event as my sister who's still in school, I was 31 years old and 6 months into my residency. I let it go. The second time, at our cousin's wedding rehearsal dinner, he told his law partner's wife that I was studying to be a doctor. As if I hadn't already spent 3 years doing exactly that. As if my residency was some kind of extended audition rather than the job itself. I pulled him aside afterward and said quietly that I was a physician. A resident, yes, but a physician. He patted my shoulder and said I was being sensitive. The third time was the banquet hall, the filing comment, the polite laughter. I smiled, and I decided. Neurosurgery residency is 7 years. 7 years of controlled chaos, of sleeping 4 hours and making decisions that would define the rest of someone's life, of building a clinical judgment so finely tuned it starts to feel like a sixth sense. By my 5th year, I was the senior resident on the cerebrovascular service. I was presenting at conferences. I had 2 papers under review. My program director had started including me in conversations about the department's future in a way that felt less like mentorship and more like planning. I did not tell my family most of this, not because I was hiding it. I'd stopped hiding things years ago, but because the telling had always felt like shouting into a room where everyone was already talking about something else. You can only do that so many times before you realize the room isn't going to quiet down for you. My mother knew the broad strokes. She was proud of me, I think, in the way that parents are proud of something they don't fully understand. Warmly, genuinely, but from a certain distance. She would tell her friends I was a brain surgeon with a pride that I found both touching and faintly ironic, given that the title had never quite made it to the dinner table without asterisks. My father's health had been declining for 2 years by then, congestive heart failure, managed but progressive. I drove home every few months to sit with him, to review his medications with his cardiologist, to translate what ejection fraction meant into language that made him feel informed rather than frightened. He let me do it. He thanked me. He never once said he was proud of what I did for a living, but he would sometimes reach over and squeeze my hand when I was explaining something, and I had learned, eventually, to take what was being offered. My brother flew in for the visits when he could. He was good in a crisis in the way that lawyers are good in a crisis. Organized, decisive about logistics, confident in a room. He handled the insurance paperwork, he talked to the financial planner. These were real things, useful things, and I'm not saying otherwise. But he also had a way of reorganizing the narrative of every room he walked into, so that he was at the center of it, not maliciously. I don't think he was ever consciously malicious. He just had no idea how to exist in a supporting role, so he didn't. It happened on a Saturday in October. My father had been admitted 2 days earlier. A fluid backup, his cardiologist adjusting his diuretic regimen, the standard dance of CHF management. He was stable but tired. The particular tiredness of someone who has been fighting their own body for long enough to know the score. My mother sat beside him in a way that I recognized as vigilance disguised as stillness. My brother arrived that afternoon with his wife. They'd driven up from DC, and within about 40 minutes, he had somehow made the conversation about a case he was working on, a high-profile commercial litigation that apparently hinged on a document review process he personally redesigned. My father was nodding. My mother was asking questions. My brother's wife was refilling everyone's coffee from the carafe she'd brought from the cafeteria. I was standing by the window, reviewing my father's chart on my phone. Not as a physician of record, I want to be clear, just as a daughter who needed to understand what she was looking at, when the hospitalist knocked and came in. He was a third-year resident named Dr. Kellerman, young, a little harried, with the particular energy of someone who had 17 patients and was trying to give each of them the impression that they were the only one. He introduced himself to the room and began talking through the morning's labs, the adjusted medication plan, the expected timeline. My brother, who was standing closest to the door, nodded along in the way people nod when they're listening, but also categorizing relevant, irrelevant, ask about this later. At one point, Dr. Kellerman glanced around the room and said, "Is there a family member who's been serving as the primary medical contact? I want to make sure we're all on the same page about the discharge planning conversation." My brother said, without pausing, without looking at me, "That would be me. I've been coordinating everything." The hospitalist nodded and began directing his discharge summary toward my brother. I watched this happen. I watched my brother receive information about medication titration and follow-up cardiology scheduling and the signs of decompensation to watch for at home. Watched him nod in the places he was supposed to nod. Asked the logistical questions he was good at asking, and I thought about saying something. I calculated it the way I calculate a surgical approach, the angle of entry, the structures I'd have to navigate around, the acceptable risk. I said nothing. Not yet. Dr. Kellerman was wrapping up, flipping his clipboard closed, when my father, who had been quieter than usual, watching, said, "You should probably talk to my daughter about the medical stuff." He gestured at me with the particular economy of movement of someone conserving energy. "She's the brain surgeon." The hospitalist paused. He looked at me with the specific expression of someone recalibrating. "Are you in practice locally?" he asked. "I'm a neurosurgery resident at Meridian Medical Center," I said. Chief resident this year. There was a brief silence. I was actually going to ask, I said, keeping my voice the way I keep it in the orate level, precise, without performance. Whether Dr. Cassidy has considered adjusting the spironolactone given the potassium trend in the last 2 draws. It's within range, but with his baseline kidney function, I'd want to watch it. Dr. Kellerman looked at me for a moment. Then he said, that's a fair flag. I'll loop in Dr. Cassidy directly. He asked me 3 more clinical questions. I answered them. He wrote 2 of the answers down. My brother stood very still by the window for the rest of that conversation. Nobody said anything about it afterward, which was its own kind of answer. My brother and his wife left around 6 to check into their hotel. My mother walked them out, and I sat with my father in the quiet that settled after they were gone. The specific quiet of a hospital room at early evening. The hallway sounds muffled, the monitors steady and indifferent. My father looked at the ceiling for a long moment. You should have said something sooner, he said. Not accusatory, just observational. A man who spent 30 years figuring out why things were built the way they were, looking at a problem. I know, I said. Why didn't you? I thought about it honestly. The way you think about things when you're too tired to construct a better answer. I kept hoping it would sort itself out. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Doesn't work that way. No, I said. I'm learning that. He reached over and put his hand on mine. The same gesture as always, the hand that had built things for 31 years, rough and warm and certain. You're good at what you do, he said. It was the most direct version of that sentence he had ever said to me, and I understood that it cost him something to say it plainly, without the scaffolding of implication or indirection. Thank you, I said, and I meant it as simply as he'd said it. I finished my residency 11 months later. I accepted a position as an attending neurosurgeon at Meridian Cerebrovascular, which was what I'd wanted since I was 23, and watched a surgeon clip an aneurysm with the focused calm of someone diffusing something precious. My first solo case as an attending was a cavernous malformation resection, a patient in her 50s who'd been having seizures for 3 years and woke up the next morning and cried because she felt, for the first time she could remember, quiet inside her own head. I called my father when I got home from that shift. It was 11:30 at night, and I knew he went to bed early now, that his energy was rationed differently than it used to be, but I called anyway. He picked up on the 3rd ring. I told him about the case, not the clinical details, just the shape of it. The woman who'd woken up quiet. He listened all the way through without interrupting, which was not something he always did. When I finished, he said, I used to worry about you. Did you know that? I suspected, I said. Not because I thought you couldn't do it, he said. I want you to know that. I just didn't understand what it was you were doing, and that scared me more than I knew how to say. I sat with that for a moment. Outside my kitchen window, the city was doing what cities do at midnight. Cars, lights, the distant structure of other people's lives continuing. I know, I said. You're good at what you do, he said again. Like he needed to say it twice. Like once hadn't been enough to make up for all the times he hadn't said it at all. My brother called me 4 months after I made attending. He'd heard through my mother, I think, or possibly through the hospital's press release about the department's new cerebral vascular program, which had included my name and a description of my subspecialty that did not involve the word filing. He said he was proud of me. He said it in the way people say things when they've realized, belatedly, that they should have said them differently all along. A little careful, a little overproduced, like a speech that's been edited too many times. I thanked him. I meant it in the way you mean things that arrive late but still arrive. I didn't tell him about the banquet hall. I didn't need to. He already knew. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from the work itself, but from years of being made to feel that the work wasn't worth much. I carried it so long that I'd stopped noticing the weight of it. The way you stop noticing the hum of a refrigerator until it goes quiet. It went quiet, eventually. Not all at once, but slowly, the way most real things change, by accumulation, by small decisions, by the particular dignity of continuing to do your work well, regardless of who was watching or who wasn't. I have a photograph on my desk. It's from my father's birthday, 2 years before he died. He made it 4 more years after that hospital admission, which was longer than his cardiologist had initially projected. And I will not pretend that doesn't matter to me. In the photograph, he's sitting at the head of the table, cake in front of him, and he's looking at me. Not at the camera. At me. There's something in his expression that I didn't catch in the moment. I only found it later, looking at the photo, something that looked, more than anything else, like recognition. Like he was finally seeing something he'd always known was there and had just needed the right light to find it. I keep the photograph because it reminds me that people can change, that understanding can arrive late and still mean something, that the story doesn't end at the hardest part. It just takes longer than you thought to reach the page where things get quiet. And sometimes quiet is everything. I used to think that if I worked hard enough, quietly enough, the people who loved me would eventually just see it, that the evidence would pile up on its own and some morning they'd wake up and the picture would be different. I believed that for a long time, long enough that the believing itself became a kind of habit, something I carried without examining it too closely. What I understand now is that people see what they've already decided to see. My brother didn't overlook my career because he lacked information. He had plenty of information. He overlooked it because the story he'd been telling himself about who I was, his little sister, the quiet one, the one still in school, was more comfortable than the revision. Updating that story would have required a certain honesty that cost something, and for a long time he wasn't willing to pay it. That's not bitterness. It's just a mechanism of how things actually work. We are, all of us, accountable to the choices we make about what we're willing to see and what we're willing to say. My brother made his choices across years of dinners and introductions and hospital rooms. I made mine too, and one of them, for too long, was to keep quiet and hope the room would sort itself out. It didn't. Rooms don't sort themselves. People have to decide to speak, or they have to let the truth speak for them. In that hospital room on that Saturday afternoon, I let it go one more time, and then my father said my name and pointed, and the room shifted. What I know about integrity, the real kind, the kind that doesn't need an audience, is that it accumulates the same way debt does. Quietly, in increments, until one day the balance is undeniable. All those years of showing up, of learning what I didn't know, of making decisions in operating rooms at 2 in the morning when no one was watching except the patient, that was the account I'd been building. It wasn't for my brother. It wasn't even for my father. It was for the woman who would have to stand in rooms like that one and know with certainty what she was worth. That kind of knowing doesn't come from being recognized. It comes from having done the work when recognition wasn't available. It comes from the intellectual discipline of staying curious past the point where it's comfortable, of asking the next question even when you're exhausted, of caring more about being right than being reassured. And it comes from something harder than either of those, from continuing to show up with decency toward people who hadn't always shown it toward you. Because that's the person you decided to be, not because you were owed anything in return. My father died understanding who I was. That came late, but it came. And I've learned not to resent the lateness too much, because the understanding, when it arrived, was real. He said it twice, like once wasn't enough. I think he was right. Some things need to be said more than once to be believed. I'm still learning which things those are.